Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
So if you were in my session yesterday for pre-writing and first drafts, which I think most of you were, you probably remember I talked about that 40-20-40 rule, where we have 40% of our time that's allocated to pre-writing, reading and researching and creating an outline. 20% is actually writing, of fleshing out a draft, and then the last 40% of our time is spent on revision. And of course, that is what we're going to focus on today for this workshop. We're going to talk about the best approaches to do so, keeping in mind that much like the pre-writing, these are general tips that writing centers and writing researchers have found to be really useful and helpful for students, but your learning is your own process, and as you reflect and learn about the best ways that you learn, keep in mind that you can play around with the best techniques that work for you. But when we're first starting, it's good to try a bunch of things and see what sticks. Okay, so the first step that I like to say is treat the revision process like a new project. Think of it as a separate assignment. It might even be worthwhile in our scheduling, as we talked about in how to be an online student and keeping track and keeping organized of our schedule, to have an actual set time for deadlines, not for when the paper is due necessarily for the assignment for a class, but when you'd like to have your first draft due, and then due to yourself. So you have a first draft done maybe the week before it's actually due, and you can schedule that, and that gives you a week to have a separate time to revise. And that's probably a good idea, just for your own sake of keeping organized. So general revision tips, just to get started. Number one is take a break. That's the very first thing we want to do. Give your eyes and your brain a rest. So if you've been writing away, you're finished that 20% and you're finished your first draft, rather than saying, okay, back to the start we go, and slogging through the first revision process, move away, go for a walk, have some snacks, have some food, or if you're really busy and you've got a lot going on, work on another assignment. You can do something else that's still productive, but just take a step away from the work itself. And the main reason for that is that when we're revising, we really want to be able to look at our work from an outsider's perspective. And the only way we can do that is to get actual space from it. So it's good to start off that way. This isn't accessible to everybody, but it's also a good idea to print a hard copy and make notes as you read. At the Writing Center, when we're open physically, hopefully in the future, we require students to show up with a hard copy of their paper, and we actually write in pencil on the paper itself. And working through this way, research shows that working through a physical copy allows us to see and identify things in our paper that we wouldn't have otherwise. If that's not possible, not a problem. It would still be a good idea to maybe use a PDF editor, perhaps, and that way you can mark up by hand. If you have, like, say, one of those pen tablet devices, that can be handy. That's ideal, but again, if it's not possible, not a problem. Particularly if you don't have a hard copy, it's really beneficial to read out loud and read it to an audience. So saying it out loud, whether it's to yourself or to other people, also allows you to identify issues or problems or some holes maybe in your argument that you wouldn't have before. Step 5 is, of course, read critically. I think critical thinking and generally criticism is one of the number one things that we really have been hitting hard on for this week. And that doesn't just include reading critically your research and other papers. It also means reading your own work critically. And that's tough, but it will make your papers and make your research so much better and really help you with your learning process as well. And the last tip, which we'll get into in a bit more detail, is to start broadly and then work towards smaller details. So there's a general order of operations where we start broad. We start with looking at the structure of your paper. We look at the opening and the body and the conclusion and how that flows. We talk about an hourglass shape. where we start broad with that opening topic sentence, and we get more narrow as we speak to specific research and our specific arguments. And then we open up again in the conclusion as we think forward when we look at the field in general. So that's where that hourglass shape reference comes from. And the overall flow. Do the ideas link together in a good order? So here we're looking at the paper as a whole. The second step is getting a little bit more narrow and looking at clarity. So this is sentence order. Here we're looking within paragraphs to see how our paragraph flows, relationship and relevance of ideas. This is where we really talk and look at transitions and transitional devices. There is in this session on Brightspace, there are a number of handouts that we've developed at the Writing Center. And one of them that I find really helpful that I often recommend to students is called Transitional Devices. And that helps come up with words, comes up with the vocabulary to show how you can relate your ideas so that it's clear to the reader what it is that you're saying about them. And the last step, then we get into details. That's when we're looking at grammar and when we're looking at sentence level issues. And this is the last thing that we want to focus on. The reason for that is I personally have a really hard time skipping over typos and grammar issues right off the bat. But the reason for this really is that we want to make sure that we spend time looking at that first structure and the second clarity level of our paper. And we want to revise that. And we don't want our minds to get distracted by looking at grammar and sentence level issues, because those ones are a little bit easier to notice, right? And so the main thing is that we want to stay focused and mindful on the first two. And this can also be a bit of a recursive process, much like writing itself. So I have this cartoon over here on the little side of revision angst. So here we have a researcher who's written the most beautiful paragraph, and she's just having a really hard time cutting it out because it's beautiful. Cutting things is really difficult. So revising means rearranging stuff, especially at that first level of the order of operations. It might mean reparagraphing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and ultimately cutting. And cutting is really difficult when you've put so much time into it. And sometimes, your paper, your work, it's like your baby. It's a creative output, and it's really hard to get rid of it and destroy it. But ultimately, that's what critical thinking about our own work means. It means reading something and deciding, does this actually serve the point that I'm trying to make? Does this help my argument? Does it support it? And if not, it gets removed. Almost every grad student has some kind of story in which they've removed pages and pages or chapters, entire chapters of their thesis in the writing process. And it's hard and it's sad, but ultimately, the whole process of writing is still a learning experience, and it makes your work better. So it's good in the long run. Revising also means expanding on a particular idea. So maybe you haven't touched on enough aspects of something. Maybe your view is too narrow to get your point home, and so you need to expand on some greater ideas. It might mean condensing. So the opposite, maybe this is something I find really common, something being really wordy, really verbose and kind of repetitive, or providing too much information, which we talked about a little bit in Adrian's session just now with paraphrases that were too long, and trying to get it to be as condensed and concise as possible. And also deepening. So this is different from expanding in that we're not looking at other ideas necessarily, but within our own ideas, we're providing a deeper and more thorough analysis of the ideas that we've presented. We're saying, is this point that I've provided enough? Has it been explained thoroughly for the reader to understand and to buy whatever argument it is that I'm selling? So when we revisit our paper, when we revise, we also revisit our thesis, which I also mentioned yesterday in that pre-writing session, that we always go back to that and we always rethink it. So the final thesis can only be confirmed once the essay is finished. Your ideas will change as you write and think, and this is a really good thing because it shows that you're learning and it shows that you're thinking about it. Don't be afraid to change your thesis to help it match what you wrote. Ultimately, if you had a really narrow thesis, maybe you narrowed it down to a particular region, but then as you wrote, you expanded your ideas a little bit more. Maybe you found some research that looked at other aspects of the issue that you hadn't originally considered. You can go back to your thesis and expand it out to exactly match what it is that you wrote. And recognize when you've had insights. It does seem like a lot of work, and sometimes it is, to go back to a thesis and change it and have this constantly recursive process. But if you have a good idea, run with that good idea. Don't kind of push it aside because it needs more work. So when we get to the paragraph revision step, we mentioned yesterday that a paragraph is a unit of thought. It's a unit of an argument. So we want to ask first, is there one clear claim? Is that what this paragraph is addressing? So we want to make sure that within the paragraph, the claim is being stated directly, and that might be in the topic sentence, that might be in the explanation where we integrate our evidence back to reference our thesis. We also want to consider breaking complex paragraphs into several clear points. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but if you have a paragraph that really actually seems to be making more than one claim, that likely means that it's more than one paragraph. Is the claim strongly related to your thesis? Make sure that there is clear language to tell the reader how your point is advanced, how it's moved forward by this particular claim that you're making. And cut paragraphs that do not further your thesis, which we've already mentioned a bit. And is the paragraph repeating information? If you have, it seems like the same claim, maybe you have multiple pieces of evidence, but ultimately the point is identical. You can have multiple pieces of evidence in the same paragraph. The important thing is to make sure that your ideas are cohesive and contained, and it's clear what the point of that paragraph is, that it's serving a particular claim. And so this is an idea where we might want to combine paragraphs if that is the case. So this is the first exercise that I usually advise students to take. Once we have looked at that first level of organization and we think that the intro, body, and conclusion and how they all relate and the order of our ideas across the whole paper is good, then when we get into this structural paragraph level of revision, this is generally the first kind of exercise I advise. So I read through the essay, and within the margins, or maybe if you're working on Word, for instance, then you might use the track changes and add a comment, highlight the whole paragraph and add a comment, and write a few words or a very short phrase that summarizes the claim of that paragraph. What is the point of that paragraph? If in this process you feel the need to write more than one point or more than one phrase, or it's really long, that might indicate that there's actually two paragraphs within that and it might need to be split up. Conversely, if you do this process and you have the same point, the same paraphrase, or sorry, not paraphrase, but the same short phrase in the margins of multiple paragraphs, it might be a good idea to combine them and condense them and shorten your ideas because it might be looking like you're getting a bit repetitive there. So this is a good process just to get started to have an idea of whether your paragraph structure is serving your argument or not. Okay. So looking at transitions and logical flow, so looking between your paragraphs. Remember that your essay is an argument. So we want to think like a lawyer, right? We're trying to convince our reader that what you're saying is valid, that what you're thinking and what you're communicating is correct. So is the overall structure logical and consistent? Is it easily followed? Are the points connected? And do you use transitional devices between paragraphs and sentences? I mentioned before that handout with transitional devices, and that can be used between sentences. So transitional devices are words that show things like causation. So maybe because is caused by, as a result of, something that communicates a contradiction. So conversely, or on the other hand, or in opposition, words that communicate how the ideas relate. And those things are really, really key to make your ideas clear. Consider how to best convince your reader. Is it better to lead with your last point or save it for last? And that's totally up to you, really. I generally tend to be more on the side of saving it for last because I like that build up and then a hard hit at the end. But not necessarily, it really depends on the essay. And are there examples or explanations that you could use to help your reader understand? This, of course, often these examples, explanations will come from your research, from your sources, but not necessarily. Even in reflective writing, it's good to help your reader understand by using examples. That example might come from class, it might come from your own idea, but those are key to help communicate clearly. Okay, so once we've done those first two levels of revision, now we're on to the final one of proofreading. So this is the final polish. So as I mentioned before, we only look for sentence level errors after all revision is complete. We want to use the last couple of read-throughs to find typos and errors. Remember that proofreading is not foolproof and that we need to use spell checker wisely. And I have a couple examples of this here. So the first one, Remember that proofreading is not foolproof. I'm going to read this out loud. According to a researcher at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So some of you might have seen this before. Feel free to comment if you have. It's pretty common, run around the internet for a little while, a bit of a meme, quote unquote. And it's really clear from this is really obviously wrong because every word is mixed up. But if you just had a couple words as you read through really quickly, it's really easy to miss things like this. And spell check will help, but spell checker is also not foolproof. So here we have a poem that says, I have a spelling checker. It came with my PC. It plainly marks for my review mistakes I cannot see. I strike a key and type a word and wait for it to say, whether I am wrong or right, it shows me straight away. As soon as a mistake is made, it knows before too long, and I can put the error right. It's rarely ever wrong. I have run this poem through it. I am sure you're pleased to know. It's letter perfect all the way. My checker told me so. So obviously here we have a number of homonyms. That's mainly what's going on. But it still makes the point that spell checker also is not foolproof. Now it's true that spell checker will also underline grammatical issues, and it would definitely identify those within this poem. But it doesn't necessarily tell you how to fix it. And that's also a good thing. I'm going to take a moment right now just to speak about programs and software like Grammarly. Some students, especially non-native English speakers or students for whom English isn't necessarily their first language, or if you're not comfortable writing in English just yet, really go to Grammarly to help them write. I can see why it's a useful tool, but it does, there are some conceptual issues as far as Grammarly and academic integrity and plagiarism, because Grammarly doesn't just fix incorrect grammar, it also creates suggestions that are different from how you write. It creates a different voice. And there are sometimes where I've met with students and I comment on a sentence and I say, this is kind of awkwardly structured, or it doesn't flow really well, or the style doesn't match the rest of your style of writing. And they said, oh yeah, Grammarly made this recommendation that I change this. And for me, like, that's a big cue that Grammarly is changing their writing from what it actually is. And what we really want in university is for you to communicate effectively, right? What we want is for you to develop your ideas and share them in a way that feels right and comfortable for you. And your professors want to know that you're doing that as well. And that's our whole process. And we're here to support you with that as you learn and become comfortable with your own voice in writing. That's my 2 cents about Grammarly. Just had to get it out there. Okay. So are there any questions at this point as far as like the review process and an overall approach? In the session after lunch, we're going to talk about grammar a little bit, and we're going to actually put this into practice. So for right now, this was a very theoretical approach, but I'm just going to open the chat. And if anybody has any questions, any thoughts about revision, I'm also interested to know what your approach in revision has been. Yeah, Vivek, that's a really good point. So I am going to add to that as well. It is, of course, always good to revise your work first. I will mention that us at the Writing Center, yesterday, I walked you through and showed you WC Online. We have that schedule available, and you are welcome to bring your paper with us at any stage. That said, personally, I won't speak for all of the writing tutors. Jen can add to this if she'd like, but I think it's best for students to come to see a writing center tutor, either at the very beginning of the writing process or very early on. Maybe you've already done some research and you're having a hard time getting started. That's a place where we can really help you out. Conversely, as Vivek mentioned, we can help out after you've already done a bit of personal revision yourself so that we know where you're at. If you just like have a rough draft and bring it to us, it's really hard for us to know the best way to help you because we don't know if these are just, spelling things that you've missed or if they're actual writing issues that are common for you that we can help with. So it's always a good idea. Again, as Amanda mentioned earlier in the How to Be an Online session, we're not an editing service. You can do that on your own, and you can learn how to do that through your own writing. What we do is help you in the writing process. And that's also true for getting peers or for getting someone else to help you as well. When I last gave this presentation, I also had a student ask me if it had to be done in this order, and if it's possible, like if you can revise while you write. And personally, I do end up doing some revision while I write. I always make sure that I have, at the very least, I make sure that I write whole paragraphs before revising, sometimes multiple paragraphs. And then maybe that's all I'm going to do for the day. Maybe I'm not sitting down for the session to write out a whole essay, but if I want to write a section and then revise that, then that's perfectly fine. I also mentioned that sometimes I have a hard time not noticing or correcting typos and little grammatical errors. And so sometimes I also find it good to do one round of that and then go back to the beginning and start revising from that number one higher level of revision, just so that I can see that I'm going to be focused on that structural level. So that's an approach as well. The main thing though is that if you do decide to revise midway through the writing process, that when you're done your writing entirely, when you have that draft, to do another round of revision through the whole thing right from the beginning, and to get that space and take that break in between those two stages. I'm going to leave you with this final exercise. That again would be after, if you've done that paragraph revision exercise and you're at this sort of revision stage in your paper, to read you through your paper using these techniques discussed, focusing on structural and transitional and paragraph level revisions in that order, and then getting to grammar, and make note of any changes that you would like to make, and then go through and make those changes.